If we can please be seated so we can start. Well, welcome. My name is Larry Fields, and I'm the Flight Standards Division Manager for the Eastern Region. So welcome to everyone today. I think we have folks from up in the New England area. I believe we even have some customers attending, and that's great. This is, as inspectors in the field for years in dealing with operational control issues and how we look at DBAs and lease agreements. This is critical for us to all be on the same page, to understand what operational control really means, and also be able to work with our customers and helping them understand their responsibility that they have with operational control. So I know today's a pretty packed agenda. So I want to be able to introduce the folks who will be putting on the presentation from Washington headquarters. And let me start out with Ken Stevens from AFS 200. Enjoy your day.
All right. Thank you, Larry. I have the lavalier. Can everybody hear me? Obviously, if you can't, you won't. See some familiar faces out there. Still keep fooling them, I guess. All right. I apologize for the little delay in starting here, but we'll make it up as we go along here. First of all, thank you everyone for coming today. My name is, as Larry said, Ken Stevens. I'm an inspector assigned to the Air Transportation Division at FAA headquarters located in Washington, D.C., if you didn't already know that. We're going to talk today about operational control, what it is, what it isn't. It is a joint project between Flight Standards and the Office of Chief Counsel. Let's see if I can get this to work. All right, we're going to facilitate an understanding of what operational control requirements are, what they're not. We'll talk about OpSpec A008. You already should have a copy of that, a revised version of A008. And we'll talk about a new operational control PTRS R item later in the day. Right now, as you know, a 1636 is something that is associated with a base inspection. Because of its importance, there was a sense that we need to separate an operational control inspection from a base inspection. But you'll be getting more on that as we go along in the day. All right, how are we going to do this? Well, as I said, we're going to have PowerPoint presentations. Of course, we have the standard death by PowerPoint here. We'll have PowerPoint presentations by both representatives from the Office of Chief Counsel and representatives in the form of myself from Flight Standards. So we'll talk about some recent case studies, I should say, some examples, and we will try to impart as much information under the lessons learned that we have found out over the year and a half or so we've been doing this. Presenters will be from AGC. This morning will be Doug Mullen. Hooper and Harlan are not here today. They're here, that's AFS 250. I'll explain who they are and what AFS 250 is about later. Alan Horowitz from AGC and myself from, as I said, Flight Standards. Today's schedule, you all should have a copy of that today. As Larry said, this is a fairly packed day, a lot of information. I think a lot of good information based on what I've seen from doing these workshops from around the country and talking with folks. I think a lot of, as I said, a lot of important information. All right, what is operational control? More importantly, what isn't it? Is operational control just simply flight following, dispatch, flight locating? No. That's an element of operational control. That's not operational control. What are some of the key factors in assessing operational control? I think the lawyers have a term called indicia that you might hear later today that will give examples of how you determine whether someone truly has operational control. What are some of the examples where an air carrier has surrendered operational control to a non-air carrier? We'll talk about that, and we'll provide some examples where an air carrier does not have adequate operational control. We'll talk about what a DBA is. Everybody know what a DBA is, doing business as? It's a fictitious name, not a real name. It's often associated with situations which in the aviation business may lead to confusion, may in fact create a misunderstanding about who actually is operating the aircraft. We'll talk about why these DBAs are important. We all know who actually ends up approving these DBAs. That's you guys out there. You're the ones that put it on A001 as such. We'll talk about what a wet lease is, what's an illegal wet lease. We'll talk about other examples of agreements between aircraft owners and certificate holders as well. Some of these you'll see or probably have heard characterized as management agreements, sublease agreements, lease agreements. There's all sorts of names for them, but they all basically end up being pretty much the same kind of document. Anyway, we'll talk about those. We'll talk about when I started this, and I was initially talking to inspectors about it, there seemed to be some confusion on the part of whether or not a pilot, for example, could maintain operational control. So I decided that we needed to talk about those necessary actions that are done by the certificate holder, and those actions, and differentiate between those and the pilot in command as such. Pilot in command cannot exercise operational control. Can operate the aircraft, certainly, but cannot exercise operational control. Some case studies that Alan will talk about. Darby Aviation. Some people believe that Darby Aviation started this process. Yes, for the most part. I would say that's when I got involved in it. The Darby Aviation accident. You'll hear about Aero Leasing, American Air Network, and some others that as we keep going along, unfortunately, more revocations, more suspensions, more problems, and unfortunately, more to come. Some of the current policy and guidance material, if you did not get an opportunity to read it, there was a Federal Register notice on wet leasing. It was put in the Federal Register. I don't know about you, but every night before I go to bed, I get out my personalized copy of the Federal Register and read through that. For those of you that missed it, some very good information. We intend to respond and answer some of the questions already, but it laid the foundation for the most part as to not only these sessions and some of the information that we have found out about, but more importantly, it allowed the public to know what direction we were going, not only in the area of wet leasing, but of operational control. FAA Notice 8483 has technically expired. That's because I can't guess very well when we were going to get OPSPEC A008 out. Say that 3 times real fast. I assumed that we would be able to get the OPSPEC out, and it would have, in essence, taken the place of 8483. Even though it is technically has expired, 8483 contains a lot of good information about the use of DBAs, operational control, and is incorporated and will be incorporated, as you will see later, when we have today's reading from A008. Yes, we'll go through A008 with some excruciating detail. Also, for those of you involved in air ambulance, how many folks deal with the air ambulance crowd? You know that you have a requirement that before you can add a aircraft to the OPSPECs, you may or may not know, that before you can add an aircraft to the OPSPECs, that you have to call or write this individual in Washington before you can do that. Some people have wondered the reason for this. I won't take time here to talk about, other than just to simply say the air ambulance operations have a lot of concern, at least started about a year or so ago, about the time frame that we put out 8485 and continues. Some people believed that the 8400, that this notice would be canceled. It will not be canceled. In fact, it will probably be expanded as such. For those of you that don't have air ambulance operators, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Anyway, OpSpec A008, as we know, that's the operational control OpSpec. That is normally where the operator has free-flowing text about some meandering about how this operator will flight locate, will file flight plans or something to that effect. I know because I've read dozens upon dozens of A008s. Yeah, I know, I don't have anything else better to do in life. But in reading through there, it became clear that the folks that are authorizing and approving A008 don't understand what is supposed to be in place. So we revised A008 for many reasons I'll talk about later this afternoon. But one of them was to send home the message of just exactly what we're looking for in operational control, and to try to alleviate this requirement to having to review every single lease agreement. You still may have to review a lease. That's why you still have to understand what a wet lease is, what a dry lease is, what is an illegal wet lease, what is a legal wet lease. You need to be able to understand that. Clearly, we're not trying to turn inspectors into lawyers or lawyers into inspectors, but you do need to have some information about what you're looking for in these leases, because the leases provide the foundation for the procedures that you all end up approving. All right. Anyway, there's other requirements in there that we determined to be necessary in A008, and like I said, we'll go over that. Also, I will talk briefly about the R item that you will be looking at later this the new fiscal year, and obviously we'll be updating Inspector Handbook Procedures and Practices. Handbook Procedures and Practices, we'll be doing that. There was, when we were doing these with in sponsorship with our partners with NATA and NBA, they did post copies of all the presentations on their website, and that's what that NATA website is. And they are no longer sponsoring. We finished up to 10, and so we are no longer, well, we're still in partnership with them. We're not necessarily in this project. They're not supporting it as such, even though the information still remains on that website and in our own website, which you can find copies. I just throw it up there so you've already got a paper copy in your hand. This at least gives you an opportunity to look at, if for some reason you want to look at all the presentations. All right, let me just recently the board. It was a Challenger accident in Montrose, Colorado. You all may or may not be aware of. In that crash, 3 people were killed. One of the participants was Dick Ebersol. Dick Ebersol is the vice president in charge of NBC Sports. His son died in the accident. He nearly died as well. The board put out some preliminary information about the cause of the accident. But in it, one of the members, and I'll just read briefly what one of the members said about another area which I think you all will start to identify with. Anyway, he said in his, it wasn't a dissenting opinion, but a contributing opinion to the causal factors to the accident. He says that the U.S. Part 135 operators were left without proper FAA safety oversight for 9 years, according to a board member statement, added to the NTSB accident investigation report into the November 2004 crash of an Air Castle. Air Castle, by the way, as I believe was an Eastern Region certificate just after takeoff in Montrose, Colorado, in which 3 people died and the other 3 people on board were seriously injured. The probable cause of the accident, as outlined in the accident report, is that the aircraft went out of control because the wing was contaminated with snow and ice. Actually, anybody who flies the Challenger knows that just frost is enough to stall the wing. And the 4 other accidents that have taken place, just a slight coating of frost on the wings enough for it to stall, and that's exactly what it did. Stall. The plane went out of control. Anyway, he went on to say, a contributing factor was that the crew did not have some recent flying experience in similar conditions. However, this accident investigation is significant for a number of reasons. It represents a whole subset of an aviation industry that is growing and that deserves more attention from us, talking about the NTSB FAA, for more oversight by the FAA. While it is true that the crew's failure to inspect the wings for contamination was the immediate cause of the accident, there were factors involved in this accident that are factors in other Part 135 air charter operations that should be addressed before they become causal to future accidents involving air charter. The NTSB goes on to explain that the lack of oversight in the 135 sector during the mid-90s, the FAA dissolved its 135 branch in flight standards. FAA reinstated that branch last year. Cooper Harris is the branch manager of AFS 250. But that segment of the industry went without significant FAA headquarters oversight for 9 years, coincidentally during the time of steady growth in the industry. The FAA still does not have the resources for the sector's proper oversight, says the board. There are often complex deals whereby operators do business under different names than that are expected even by the clients, by the NTSB and others. We observe that if an accident investigator cannot clearly decipher the structure and relationship of the various entities associated with a certificate holder, how can consumers be expected to untangle the threads of ownership and responsibility? Even charter brokers, this is another group. Charter brokers are normally considered indirect air carriers, not direct air carriers. Charter brokers carrying out research on safety of operators for clients, and this is done throughout the industry. Missed irregularities, says the report, observing that the Aircastle aircraft was registered to Hoppajet, which was located down in Fort Lauderdale, and operated by Aircastle doing business as Globe Aviation or Globe Flight 73. Globe Aviation is located in Portland, Oregon. According to the NTSB, under sanctioned FAA practices, certificate holders are authorized to conduct business under many fictitious names or DBAs, and as long as they list the alternate names in their auspects. Anyway, he goes on, and we'll read the whole thing. He goes on and on to say there is an issue here. What he's identifying is the lack of oversight by the operator to exercise proper operational control over its operations. That's what this individual is trying to say. Operational control is a safety factor. It is not just on a lot of legal terms or issues. It is a safety factor that begins from the time that 2 parties come together and offer an aircraft up for use. All right, with that said, a lot of things to do to move along. What I would ask, we've got a microphone here. If you want to ask a question, we'll give you the mic somewhere out there so everybody can hear what your question is. I would ask that you wait till the presenter finishes their presentation because they just might answer your question. If not, we'll certainly take questions at the end of each presenter's presentation. And what else? Ask questions. Look at that A008. I hope you've had an opportunity to look at it. Yes, it is 4.5 pages long. What else? 4.5 pages long. We'll take breaks throughout the day. Sit back, relax, enjoy the flight. Any questions? Good. We'll start out with Doug from AGC then.
Just turn it on. Get you started over here.
Not to panic. All right, I'm not panicking. Catch up to here in a second.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. My name is Doug Mullen. I'm an attorney in the Office of Chief Counsel, the FAA. I work in the Operations Law Branch for Joe Conti, which is AGC 220. Joe is unable to be here today, so you get me instead. A couple of things I just wanted to go over before I get started on this presentation. Again, as Ken said, if we could just hold questions until the end of the presentation, I would appreciate it. Everyone, I believe, has a copy of what I'm going to go over, so you can just write down your questions and we can address them at the end. We're going to be going over a couple of terms here that I want to specify beforehand. We're going to be going over aircraft leases. So one thing I want to make clear is when we're talking about a lessor for a lease, we're talking about an aircraft owner or somebody who is providing an aircraft. Generally, if we're talking about a lessee, we're talking about a certificate holder or an operator. Just want to clarify that. And also, during this presentation, if I'm talking about an air carrier, an operator, or a certificate holder, they're all the same entity, someone certificated under Part 119 with authorization to operate under Part 135. So the purpose of this presentation is really to go over some key concepts that everyone is going to see in the new op spec. As Ken said, the op spec is 4.5 pages long, and what we try to do is to go into very specific detail about what the FAA believes operational control is and what we're going to ask our inspectors to look at with the new R item next year, so that we can hopefully get the word out so everybody's on the same page, everybody has an understanding of what a DBA is, what we mean by operational control. So everything you're going to see in this presentation, you're going to see in the op specs. Okay, so why are we focusing on operational control? Well, as you will hear later today from Alan, we have seen some unsafe operations. The Darby case and a number of other cases where AGC 300 and various offices around the country have taken enforcement action against operators for failing to exercise operational control. So why is it a safety concept? Well, what we're talking about here for operational control are the duties and responsibilities of the certificate holder. And when we have somebody else besides the certificate holder attempting to comply with the operating rules in Part 135, we have a safety concern because they are not the people who have gone through the 119 process, who have put the time and energy into complying with 119 in Part 135. And so we want the individual, the organization that is certificated under Part 119 to be exercising operational control. We're not talking about operational control in the sense of a pilot controlling an airplane. That's completely separate. If you go through Part 135, you will see a number of obligations for pilots. But you will also see a number of obligations for the certificate holder. And we encourage everyone to take another look at Part 135 and to go through and look at all the different requirements for the certificate holder. There are record-keeping requirements, there are designating the PIC, weight and balance, making sure that pilots are qualified and have recency of experience. So we have these obligations on the pilots, but we also have obligations on the air carrier. And you will see 135. It'll say, an air carrier shall, an air carrier must. So what we're doing here is we're focusing on the obligations of the air carrier. And we're not talking about a passenger's request to go from point A to point B. There's been some confusion there, especially when we have an owner of an aircraft who's flying on an aircraft when the operator, when a certificate holder is operating the aircraft. And the owner says, I want to go from point A to point B. A lot of times people think the owner has operational control, when actually the owner is just requesting where to go. Actually, the operator has operational control. The certificate holder has operational control. An example of this, where there was some confusion, you see ACOG, the Atlantic Committee for the Olympic Games. The Atlantic Committee in 1996 arranged to have its Olympic officials transported throughout the Olympic Games. And it was and they did this through an aircraft manufacturer who was going to fly people around the games. And it was the aircraft manufacturer's position that the Olympic officials were actually in operational control of these flights flying around the games, because they were telling the operator, the manufacturer, where to go. Well, it turns out that the aircraft manufacturer, in exchange for providing this transportation, was named as an official sponsor of the games, which some companies paid millions of dollars for. So these were comp or hire flights at the Olympic Games. They were providing, the aircraft manufacturer was providing transportation to these Olympic officials, and in exchange, the manufacturer was named as a Olympic sponsor. So actually it was the aircraft manufacturer that had operational control of these flights and was responsible for all of the duties and responsibilities under Part 135. Operational control basically breaks down to two key concepts: accountability and knowledge. Who is accountable for the safe operation of the flight? And there are certain knowledge requirements. After all, if you're accountable for something, at the very least, you should have knowledge about it. So if an air carrier is operating a particular flight under Part 135, at the very least, the air carrier should know who the pilots are. They should know they should know quite a bit about the aircraft. They should know who is the PIC, whether there is a weight and balance program for that aircraft. So what we're concerned with here is who's accountable and what knowledge does the certificate holder have for certain for flights. And where we get concerned here is where we see there is an attempt to shift accountability, or there is a lack of knowledge. When we see a shift of accountability to somebody else besides the certificate holder, we get concerned, because it's the certificate holder who's put in all the time and money and effort to comply with 119 and 135. And we want the certificate holder to be the one who's exercising operational control. So we're going to go over some examples today where we've seen areas where it looks like the certificate holder is trying to shift accountability from itself to maybe an aircraft owner or to some other uncertificated entity. And another area of concern is, we're going to get into this a little bit later, is where you have an aircraft owner on board an aircraft, and you know, one thing that we really want to know before a flight takes off, and we want every party involved to know, is it a 135 flight? Is it a 91 flight? We want the pilots to know, we want the operator to know, we want the aircraft owner to know. We want everybody to know before a flight takes off who is accountable for a flight when an owner is on board. Is it the owner? Is it the air carrier? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about what we mean by operational control. And again, we're going to see a pretty detailed definition in the op specs. We are going to talk about a number of factors in assessing operational control. We're going to talk about the air carrier's relationship with a flight crew, possession or custody of an aircraft, air carrier's authorization for a flight, and knowledge of a flight, on all of these different topics. And the goal here is to is to talk to everyone and make sure everyone understands these concepts, and if you don't, please ask questions at the end. And Alan later today is going to go over some examples of loss of operational control to a non-air carrier, to an owner. He has several examples that he's going to talk about. Okay. So again, if we go to part one, there's a definition of operational control, and it means with respect to a flight, the exercise of authority over initiating, conducting, or terminating a flight. And the key phrase here is exercise of authority. And in this context, when we're talking about operational control, we are talking about, again, it's the air carrier that should be exercising authority over Part 135 flights. Again, we're not talking about a passenger who is requesting to go from point A to point B. We're not talking about the duties and responsibilities of a pilot or a PIC. We're talking about all of the air carrier responsibilities that you'll find in Part 135. We also see control in 135.77, where it says each certificate holder is responsible for operational control and shall list in the manual required by section 135.21 the name and title of each person authorized by it to exercise operational control. And here we're talking about the Part 119 management personnel who are authorized by the air carrier to exercise